The scent of damp wood and musty air greeted me as I stepped onto the grounds of Hollow Creek Manor. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style mansion, nestled deep within the woods, isolated from the rest of the world. I had taken up a temporary position as a caretaker for the house while its owners were away on a long vacation. The arrangement seemed simple enough: maintain the place, ensure nothing fell apart, and keep an eye on the property until they returned in 3 months. They had offered me a generous sum, enough to make it hard to refuse, despite the manor's grim reputation. As I stood there, suitcase in hand, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The overgrown lawn and weathered stone steps leading up to the front door seemed out of place for such a grand estate. The air was unnervingly still, as if the forest around it was holding its breath. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and walked up the steps, the wood creaking underfoot. The front door groaned as I pushed it open. The inside was just as I had imagined, grand, but in a state of disrepair. Dust coated every surface, and the air had that stale, forgotten scent that old buildings often have. The foyer was dominated by a massive chandelier, its crystals dulled by age. To my right was a sweeping staircase, its wooden banister intricately carved, though faded. Large portraits hung on the walls, depicting stern-faced figures who seemed to watch my every move. After exploring the ground floor, I found the room I would be staying in at the far end of the hallway upstairs. It was modest, with a 4-poster bed draped in heavy, moth-eaten curtains. A small window overlooked the front yard, and though it was afternoon, the light barely filtered in through the grimy glass, casting long shadows on the floor. I unpacked my things, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had clung to me since I arrived. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something about Hollow Creek Manor that felt off, as if the very walls were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. That first night was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, struggling to sleep. Just as I began to drift off, a faint noise caught my attention. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew louder: footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway just outside my door. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. It couldn't be the owners, they were miles away, and I was the only one supposed to be here. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Perhaps it was an animal, or the wind playing tricks on my senses. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, frozen in place, staring at the door handle. My pulse quickened as I waited for something, anything, to happen. But the door remained closed, and after what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps resumed, this time heading back down the hallway, growing fainter, until they disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been my imagination. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises, right? But as I went about my duties, cleaning the rooms and ensuring everything was in order, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, the strange occurrences intensified. Objects I had placed in one spot would move when I wasn't looking. I'd hear whispers in the dead of night, too faint to make out the words but enough to send chills down my spine. Doors that I had firmly shut would creak open on their own. And the footsteps, they returned every night, always stopping just outside my door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the house getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Hollow Creek Manor was hiding something, and I was beginning to fear I might not be the only one living here. On the fourth night, things took a darker turn. I had just finished cleaning the sitting room when I noticed one of the portraits hanging crooked on the wall. I walked over to straighten it, but as my fingers brushed the frame, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled my hand back, staring at the portrait. It was of a woman, her expression severe, her eyes dark and piercing. But there was something about her gaze that unsettled me. I felt as if she was looking directly at me, not in the way a painting typically does, but with intent. I quickly turned away, my heart racing. That night, the footsteps didn't stop at my door. They came inside. I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the window. I could hear the soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor, closer and closer to my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I felt a presence standing at the foot of the bed. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight I kept on the bedside table. My hand trembled as I clicked it on, casting a beam of light into the room, but there was nothing there. The door was wide open, but the room was empty. I barely slept after that. The days passed in a blur, each one more terrifying than the last. I became paranoid, jumping at every little noise, convinced that something was watching me. The footsteps became more frequent, and the whispers more insistent. I felt like I was being haunted, like the house itself was alive and it wanted me gone. On the seventh night, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things, determined to leave the manor behind. But as I reached the front door, something stopped me. It was a voice, low and menacing, coming from the shadows at the top of the staircase. "You can't leave." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to look, but the staircase was empty. Still, the voice lingered in the air, filling the house with a sense of dread. I ran out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I jumped into my car and sped down the long, winding driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror as the manor disappeared behind the trees. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Hollow Creek Manor had let me go, but I knew deep down that it wasn't finished with me. The house held its secrets close, and I had barely scratched the surface. And as I sped down the empty road, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had tried to leave and never made it out. When I first saw Briarwood Estate, it was everything I had ever dreamed of. My husband, Daniel, and I had been searching for a peaceful place to escape the chaos of city life, and the old manor nestled in the mountains seemed perfect. The large stone structure, with its ivy-covered walls and towering chimneys, exuded a kind of forgotten grandeur. It was one of those places that had once been a symbol of wealth and status but had fallen into disrepair over the years. We were drawn to it immediately. We had gotten it for a steal, probably because no one else was willing to take on the responsibility of restoring such a massive property. But Daniel and I were up for the challenge. We imagined cozy winter nights by the fireplace, sipping wine and listening to the wind howl outside. It was isolated, far enough from the nearest town that we wouldn't have to deal with nosy neighbors, but close enough to civilization to get what we needed. The first few days after moving in were busy, with unpacking and making the house feel like home. Though the house was in a state of neglect, the bones of it were solid, and we were confident we could bring it back to life. The interior was a bit dated, but there was something charming about its old world feel, the creaky wooden floors, the high ceilings, the enormous windows that let in a flood of natural light. At first, I thought the strange sounds were just the house settling. Old houses have their quirks, after all. But soon, things began happening that I couldn't explain. It started with small things. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past a doorway, or the fleeting sense that someone was standing just behind me. Each time, I would turn quickly, only to find the room empty. I didn't mention it to Daniel. He was so focused on the renovation plans that I didn't want to burden him with my growing unease. But the strangeness of the house only worsened. At night, I would hear faint voices whispering just beyond the threshold of sleep, too quiet to understand, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I convinced myself it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the old walls, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, after a long day of painting and repairing the upstairs bedroom, Daniel and I sat down in the living room for a break. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows on the walls. It was the first time in days we had truly relaxed, sipping hot cocoa and discussing our progress. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt at ease. That is, until the fireplace suddenly went out. The flames died so abruptly that it was as though someone had thrown a blanket over the fire. Daniel frowned and got up to check it out, but as he crouched down in front of the fireplace, a loud bang echoed through the house. It came from somewhere upstairs, directly above us. We both froze, staring at each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke, waiting to hear it again. "What the hell was that?" Daniel asked, standing up and looking toward the ceiling. "I don't know," I whispered, my heart racing. It sounded like something fell. We grabbed flashlights and headed up the grand staircase, which groaned under our weight. The upstairs hallway was long and dimly lit, with thick shadows lingering at the ends. As we approached the door to the master bedroom, the temperature dropped noticeably. It was so cold that I could see my breath in front of me. When Daniel pushed open the door, we saw it. Our bed, which had been perfectly made just an hour earlier, was now completely overturned. The heavy mattress had been thrown halfway across the room, and the blankets were tangled in a heap on the floor. We stood there in stunned silence, neither of us knowing what to say. Did you do this earlier?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. "Of course not," I replied, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. "Why would I?" He didn't answer, but the look on his face told me he was as freaked out as I was. We decided not to sleep in the master bedroom that night. Instead, we set up in one of the smaller guest rooms, trying to convince ourselves that the incident had a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew there was nothing rational about it. The following days were filled with more strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own, books sliding off shelves, chairs shifting across the floor when no one was in the room. The cold spots became more frequent, and the whispers at night grew louder, as if they were right next to my ear. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion or stress, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone pacing outside our bedroom door. The steady, rhythmic footsteps went back and forth, for what felt like hours. I lay there, frozen in bed, too terrified to move. When I finally gathered the courage to get up and check, the hallway was empty. But the moment I returned to bed, the pacing started again. Daniel was starting to notice things too. He didn't say much about it, but I could tell he was on edge. His usual optimism about the house had faded, replaced with a kind of quiet tension. We both felt it. The house was alive, and it didn't want us there. One afternoon, while Daniel was at the hardware store picking up supplies, I decided to explore the attic. I hadn't been up there since we moved in, and something about the mystery of it called to me. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The attic was dimly lit, with only a small window allowing a sliver of daylight to filter in. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered. As I moved through the space, I noticed an old trunk tucked into the corner. It was covered in cobwebs and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curious, I knelt down and carefully opened the lid. Inside were old photographs, letters, and various trinkets that seemed to belong to the previous owners. I sifted through them, fascinated by the glimpse into the past. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the trunk was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it and began reading. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house decades ago. As I flipped through the pages, I realized she had written about the very same things I had been experiencing. The cold spots, the whispers, the footsteps. She spoke of a presence in the house, a dark force that had tormented her and her family. As I read on, I learned that Eleanor's husband had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. She believed the house had driven him to madness, that it was haunted by something far more sinister than just a restless spirit. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic plummeted, and I heard the soft creak of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The air was thick with the feeling of being watched, and I could sense something, or someone, looming in the shadows. I slammed the trunk shut and raced downstairs, the diary clutched tightly in my hands. I knew then that we had to leave. The house wasn't just haunted, it was dangerous. Whatever had tormented Eleanor and her family was still here, and it had turned its attention on us. That night, I told Daniel everything. At first, he was skeptical, but when I showed him the diary, his face went pale. We made the decision to leave the next morning, but the house had other plans. At around midnight, we were jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. The windows in the living room had blown out, sending shards of glass across the floor. The wind howled through the broken panes, but there was something else in the air, an angry, malevolent presence that seemed to fill the room. Before we could even react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The whispers were back, louder than ever, echoing through the walls like a chorus of voices speaking in some forgotten language. Daniel grabbed my hand, and we ran for the door, but as we reached the front entrance, the door slammed shut in front of us with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. We were trapped. The footsteps began again, this time coming from all around us. They were heavy, deliberate, as if something was stalking us, closing in from every direction. Daniel tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. In a moment of sheer panic, I remembered the diary. I fumbled through the pages, searching for any mention of how Eleanor had survived. Toward the end of the diary, there was a cryptic passage about how she had sealed the entity in the house, using an old family heirloom hidden in the basement. With no other options, Daniel and I made our way to the basement. The air down there was suffocating, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. In the far corner, we found a small wooden box, exactly where the diary said it would be. Inside was a strange, ancient-looking talisman. As soon as Daniel touched it, the house seemed to come alive, the walls groaned, and the floor beneath us trembled. We knew we didn't have much time. Together, we followed the instructions from the diary, performing the ritual that Eleanor had described. The moment we completed the final step, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The whispers stopped, the footsteps ceased, and the temperature returned to normal. The house had gone quiet, as if the entity had been sealed away once more. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our things and left Briarwood Estate that night, never looking back. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about that place. I can't shake the feeling that, despite the ritual, something remains. Something dark and patient, waiting for the next family to arrive. Briarwood Estate may look like a dream, but beneath its crumbling facade lies a nightmare that refuses to be forgotten. When the opportunity arose to purchase Crowhaven Manor, I could hardly believe my luck. The sprawling 19th century mansion, located just outside of town, had been sitting vacant for years. It was beautiful in a decayed sort of way, with its Gothic architecture and towering turrets. The ivy that clung to the stone walls gave it an air of mystery, and I imagined the stories the place must hold. Even the price, an absolute steal, seemed too good to pass up. My husband, Alec, was just as enchanted by it as I was, and we quickly decided to make an offer. The previous owners had moved away after a series of tragedies, and though there were whispers around town about the place being cursed, we dismissed them as mere local superstition. We were practical people. The manor was simply old and in need of some love, nothing more. We convinced ourselves that the eerie feeling we got when we first toured the house was just our excitement mixed with the manor's long-standing neglect. From the moment we moved in, the house seemed to come alive in a way that was both exhilarating and unnerving. It was vast, far larger than we were used to, with endless hallways, grand sitting rooms, and bedrooms we hadn't even stepped foot in yet. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of setting up our new lives in this colossal place, but it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them in the dining room. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but then more unsettling things occurred. One evening, as I was unpacking boxes in the study, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though the windows were shut tight. I tried to brush it off, but the sensation lingered, like unseen eyes were watching me. The nights were worse. Crowhaven Manor creaked and groaned in a way I hadn't anticipated. The sounds seemed to come from deep within the walls, the kind of noises you can't quite place but can't ignore either. Alec assured me it was just the house settling, the old beams adjusting to the weight of years gone by. I tried to believe him, but it became harder with each passing night. One evening, Alec and I decided to explore the upper floors of the manor, rooms we hadn't yet ventured into. We found a narrow staircase tucked away behind a door in the library, leading up to the attic. The moment we reached the top, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a faint, musty smell hung in the air. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, forgotten trunks, and dust-covered portraits of long, dead family members who had once called this place home. As I wandered through the maze of old belongings, I came across a large, antique mirror propped against the wall. Its glass was smudged with dirt, but there was something about it that drew me in. I reached out to wipe the surface clean, and as I did, I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection, a shadow, darting behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Alec, sensing my unease, laughed it off. "You've been reading too many ghost stories," he said, wrapping his arm around my shoulder. "It's just an old mirror, nothing more." But I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the house. Over the next few days, I began to notice the shadow more frequently, always out of the corner of my eye, always gone by the time I turned to look. It was as if something was lurking just beyond my field of vision, waiting. Then the voices started. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a soft whispering sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere within the house. It was like the distant murmur of a conversation, but no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make out the words. Alec claimed he couldn't hear anything, but I knew what I was hearing was real. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside our bedroom. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside the door. I nudged Alec away, but by the time he stirred, the footsteps had stopped. He gradually reassured me that it was probably just the house creaking again, but I knew better. The following morning, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. While cleaning one of the unused bedrooms, I discovered a series of old letters tucked away in a drawer. They were written by a woman named Margaret Crowley, who had lived in the manor many years ago. The letters spoke of strange occurrences, voices in the night, objects moving on their own, and a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her everywhere. Margaret's final letter was the most disturbing. In it, she described how the presence in the house had become unbearable, driving her to the brink of madness. She wrote about hearing her name whispered in the dark, seeing the shadow at the foot of her bed, and feeling its icy breath on the back of her neck. The letter ended abruptly, with no explanation as to what had happened to her. I showed the letters to Alec, but he remained skeptical. "It's just an old story," he said, though I could tell he was starting to get uneasy too. People back then believed in all kinds of superstitions, but the events at Crowhaven Manor were becoming harder to explain away. One evening, as we sat in the dining room, the chandelier above us began to sway, even though there was no draught. The glass crystals tinkled softly, casting eerie reflections on the walls. Alec and I exchanged a nervous glance, but before either of us could speak, the chandelier stopped abruptly, as if someone had grabbed it. That night, I dreamt of the shadow. It loomed over me, dark and formless, whispering words I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. When I glanced over at Alec, I saw that he was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. "You heard it, didn't you?" I whispered. He nodded slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. The footsteps. They were right outside the door. We both lay there in silence, too terrified to move. It was no longer just me experiencing the haunting. Alec was beginning to feel it too. Things escalated quickly after that. The voices became louder, more insistent, and the shadow began appearing more frequently. One afternoon, while I was in the kitchen, I saw it standing in the doorway, a tall, dark figure with no discernible features. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, until it slowly dissolved into the shadows. I knew then that we had to leave. Alec was reluctant at first. He didn't want to give up on the house we had worked so hard to restore. But after another sleepless night filled with whispers and footsteps, he agreed. We packed our bags and made arrangements to stay with friends until we could figure out what to do with the manor. On our last night at Crowhaven, as we were loading the car, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of sadness. It wasn't mine, it was the house's. I could feel its sorrow, its desperation to keep us there. I turned to look back at the manor, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching us leave. We never returned to Crowhaven Manor. We sold it a few months later, to a couple who were just as enchanted by it as we had once been. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the shadow, the voices, the footsteps, but I didn't. Who would believe me? Now, every time I hear about the house, I wonder if they've started hearing the whispers yet. When my brother, Jacob, suggested renting Blackthorn House for a week-long family getaway, I wasn't initially sold on the idea. We had been planning a reunion, and while the idea of escaping to the countryside sounded nice, something about the house seemed off. The online listing showed a beautiful old-fashioned mansion tucked away in the hills of New Hampshire. It looked straight out of a Gothic novel with its towering turrets, ivy-clad stone walls, and dark wooden interiors. But there was something about it, some small detail I couldn't place, that made me feel uneasy. Despite my reservations, my wife Emily loved the idea, and so did my parents. The place was large enough to accommodate all of us, Jacob and his wife Claire, our parents, and Emily, and I. We hadn't had a family reunion in years, and Jacob was adamant that this would be the perfect spot. So I relented, hoping that the eerie feeling I got from the photos was just my imagination running wild. The drive to Blackthorn House was long and winding, the narrow road cutting through dense woods that seemed to grow darker as we approached. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house itself was even more imposing in person. Its blackened stone walls stood stark against the pale sky, and the trees around it seemed to lean in, as if trying to envelop it in darkness. "Wow," Emily whispered as we pulled up the driveway. "It's beautiful." I didn't share her enthusiasm. Something about the house felt wrong, like it didn't want us there. Jacob and Claire had arrived earlier that day, and were already settled in. They greeted us at the door, all smiles and excitement, while I tried to shake off the nagging sense of dread that had settled in my chest. My parents arrived shortly after, and we all spent the evening catching up in the grand dining room. The house was massive, with tall ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a fireplace that took up nearly an entire wall. It should have felt cozy, but instead, it felt oppressive, as if the house itself was watching us. That first night, as we all headed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet. No creaks from the old floorboards, no wind rustling through the trees outside. Just an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, and at some point during the night, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Emily getting up to use the bathroom. But when I turned over, she was still asleep beside me. The footsteps were soft, slow, and deliberate, moving down the hallway outside our room. I listened, holding my breath, as they passed our door and continued down the corridor. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for them to fade, but they didn't. They stopped just outside our door. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound of someone, or something, standing just on the other side of the door. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if whoever was out there was testing it. I wanted to get up, to open the door and confront whatever was standing there, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly retreated, moving back down the hallway and disappearing into the distance. The next morning, I chalked it up to exhaustion and my overactive imagination. After all, Blackthorn House was old, and old houses made strange noises. But when I mentioned the footsteps to Jacob at breakfast, he went pale. "You heard them too?" he asked quietly, glancing around to make sure the others weren't listening. I nodded. "Yeah, outside our door last night. I thought it was one of you, but it wasn't," Jacob interrupted. "Claire heard them too. She woke me up in the middle of the night because she thought someone was walking around upstairs. But when I went to check, no one was there." We exchanged uneasy glances but decided not to tell the others. We didn't want to ruin the trip with ghost stories, especially since our parents were having such a good time. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. As the days went by, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lights flickered on and off by themselves, objects seemed to move on their own, and we all began hearing voices, whispers, just on the edge of hearing, as if the house itself was speaking to us. At first, it was easy to dismiss these things as quirks of an old house. But then, Emily saw the woman. It was late one night, and we were sitting in the living room by the fireplace. The others had gone to bed, and Emily and I were enjoying the quiet, trying to shake off the unsettling atmosphere that had settled over the house. Emily had been staring into the fire when she suddenly went rigid, her eyes widening in terror. "There's someone in the hallway," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to look, but the hallway was empty. "No, she's there," Emily insisted, her voice shaking. "A woman, standing right there." I stood up, my heart racing, and walked to the hallway, but there was no one there. When I turned back to Emily, she was pale and trembling. "She was watching us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked so angry. That was the moment I knew we needed to leave. I didn't care how beautiful the house was or how much money we had spent on the trip. Something was very wrong with Blackthorn House, and I wasn't willing to stick around to find out what it was. But leaving wasn't as easy as I had hoped. That night, as we packed our bags, the house seemed to come alive. The walls creaked and groaned, and the floorboards beneath our feet felt like they were shifting. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with words we couldn't understand. And then, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't slow or deliberate. They were fast, frantic, as if someone, or something, was running through the house. The sound echoed through the hallways, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. Emily clutched my arm, her face pale with fear, as we stood frozen in the center of the room. Suddenly, the door to our room slammed shut, trapping us inside. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the whispering started again, louder than before, as if it was coming from all around us. The air grew cold, and I could feel something, some presence, pressing in on us, suffocating us. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by fear. But eventually, the door creaked open, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our bags and ran, not stopping until we were outside in the cold night air. We left Blackthorn House that night, abandoning the rest of our belongings. We never spoke of what happened to the others, not wanting to scare them, but I know they felt it too. There was something in that house, something dark and malevolent, and it didn't want us to leave. A few months later, I did some research on Blackthorn House, hoping to find some explanation for what we experienced. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. The house had a long history of tragedy. The original owner, a wealthy widow named Lillian Blackthorn, had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. She had lived in the house alone after her husband's mysterious death, and there were rumors that she had been involved in dark rituals, using the house to commune with the dead. She had died under suspicious circumstances, and since then, every family that had lived in Blackthorn House had experienced strange, often violent occurrences. I don't know if Lillian's spirit still haunts the house, or if something darker lurks within its walls. All I know is that Blackthorn House is cursed, and whatever lives there is waiting for its next victims. We were lucky to get out when we did, but I'll never forget the terror I felt in that house. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, as if they followed us home. When I first heard about Windermere Manor, I was immediately captivated. The real estate agent described it as a grand 19th century estate, nestled in the hills just outside the small town of Ashburn. It had been on the market for years, the price dropping lower and lower until it seemed too good to be true. I couldn't understand why no one had snatched up such a beautiful property, especially at that price. But then, during my first visit, I understood. There was something deeply unsettling about Windermere. It was in perfect condition, far too perfect for a house that had supposedly been abandoned for decades. The stone walls were intact, the windows clear of dust, and the garden appeared meticulously cared for, as though someone had been tending to it all along. Yet, there was a coldness in the air, something that seemed to push you away the moment you set foot on the grounds. "Are you sure about this place?" my husband Michael asked as we pulled up the driveway for our second viewing. He had been skeptical from the start, his unease growing every time we talked about the house. "I know it's a little eerie," I replied, catching myself just in time, "but it's a steal. We won't find anything like this again, especially not for this price. And it's exactly what we've been looking for, a quiet place to settle down." Michael didn't look convinced, but he knew how much I loved the house. I had always dreamed of living in an old manor, surrounded by history and character. Windermere seemed like the perfect place to start the next chapter of our lives. We finalized the deal a week later and moved in the following month. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of unpacking, and for a while, it felt like any other move. But the strangeness of Windermere began to creep in almost immediately. The first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. At first, I thought it was Michael, but when I turned over, he was still asleep beside me. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside our bedroom door. I lay there listening, my heart pounding in my chest, but eventually, the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, I was barely sleeping at all. The footsteps were relentless, moving up and down the hallway, sometimes stopping right outside our door. Michael, of course, heard nothing. He slept soundly every night, oblivious to the strange sounds that filled the house after dark. It wasn't just the footsteps, though. There were other things, too small, inexplicable occurrences that left me questioning my own sanity. I would leave a room, only to return a few minutes later to find objects moved or rearranged. Lights flickered on and off without warning, and the air seemed to grow colder, no matter how high we set the thermostat. One morning, I found all the windows on the ground floor wide open, even though I was certain I had closed them the night before. Another time, I walked into the kitchen to find the faucet running, the sink overflowing with water. At first, I thought Michael might have left it on by mistake, but when I asked him about it, he swore he hadn't touched it. I tried to brush off the incidents, telling myself that it was just the quirks of an old house. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was a presence in Windermere, something that didn't want us there. One night, about a month after we moved in, I finally saw her. I had woken up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time, they weren't just in the hallway, they were in our room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and that's when I saw her, a woman, standing at the foot of our bed. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her long hair hanging in tangled waves around her face. Her eyes were dark, empty, and she stared at me with an expression of pure hatred. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe as she took a step closer. The air around her seemed to shimmer with cold, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I sat there, trembling, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream. But the next morning, when I told Michael what I had seen, he didn't laugh it off like I had expected. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and fear. I saw her too, he admitted quietly, the night before last. I didn't want to say anything because I thought maybe I was just imagining it. That was when I knew we were in trouble. Whatever was haunting Windermere wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was getting stronger. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house escalated. The footsteps became more frequent, the cold spots more intense, and the woman appeared more often, always at night, always watching us with those dark, empty eyes. She never spoke, but her presence filled the house with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried researching the history of Windermere, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening, but the more I dug, the less I found. There were no records of any deaths or tragedies associated with the house, no stories of hauntings or paranormal activity. It was as if the house's history had been wiped clean, leaving only the present terror behind. One night, as we sat in the living room, huddled together in front of the fireplace, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. Michael and I both jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding in unison. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the stairs. I wanted to protest, to tell him not to go, but my voice caught in my throat. I watched as he disappeared up the staircase, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, listening to the silence, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my own flashlight and followed him upstairs. The house was deathly silent, the only sound my own footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I checked every room, but there was no sign of Michael. Panic set in as I searched the house from top to bottom. calling his name over and over again. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. I called the police, but they found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, no evidence that he had even been in the house at all. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. In the days that followed, I tried to hold on to hope, but deep down, I knew the truth. Michael was gone, and Windermere had taken him. I moved out of the house a week later, leaving everything behind. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, not with the memories of what had happened. But even now, as I sit in my new apartment, far away from Windermere, I can't escape the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the footsteps again, soft and deliberate, just outside my door. And I know she's still watching, waiting for her next victim. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe, as she took a step closer. The air around her seemed to shimmer with cold, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I sat there, trembling, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream. But the next morning, when I told Michael what I had seen, he didn't laugh it off like I had expected. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and fear. I saw her too, he admitted quietly, the night before last. I didn't want to say anything because I thought maybe I was just imagining it. That was when I knew we were in trouble. Whatever was haunting Windermere wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was getting stronger. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house escalated. The footsteps became more frequent, the cold spots more intense, and the woman appeared more often, always at night, always watching us with those dark, empty eyes. She never spoke, but her presence filled the house with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried researching the history of Windermere, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening, but the more I dug, the less I found. There were no records of any deaths or tragedies associated with the house, no stories of hauntings or paranormal activity. It was as if the house's history had been wiped clean, leaving only the present terror behind. One night, as we sat in the living room, huddled together in front of the fireplace, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. Michael and I both jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding in unison. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the stairs. I wanted to protest, to tell him not to go, but my voice caught in my throat. I watched as he disappeared up the staircase, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, listening to the silence, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my own flashlight and followed him upstairs. The house was deathly silent, the only sound my own footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I checked every room, but there was no sign of Michael. Panic set in as I searched the house from top to bottom, calling his name over and over again. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. I called the police, but they found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, no evidence that he had even been in the house at all. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. In the days that followed, I tried to hold on to hope, but deep down, I knew the truth. Michael was gone, and Windermere had taken him. I moved out of the house a week later, leaving everything behind. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, not with the memories of what had happened. But even now, as I sit in my new apartment, far away from Windermere, I can't escape the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the footsteps again, soft and deliberate, just outside my door. And I know she's still watching, waiting for her next victim.